In this screencast, we're going to examine organic mental disorders. And when we talk about organic mental disorders, what we're talking about are things where disturbances basically result directly from an injury or a disease in the brain. So that's the issue there. Now, the most common thing that people think of in this regard is Alzheimer's disease, because that's one that affects so many different families now today. Alzheimer's disease, just to give you an idea, as of 2013, over 5 million people, 5.2 million approximately, people in the United States alone had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And basically, about 11% of all the people over age 65 have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and about 32% of people over the age of 85. It's the sixth leading cause of death in the United States as of 2013. So it's a major issue. Okay, now what is Alzheimer's disease? Well, it involves the progressive destruction of the brain cells, literally the cells in the brain. The brains that are examined that have Alzheimer's tend to show lesions, that's cuts or tears or destruction. They have tangles of nerve fibers and basically loss of brain cells. Now the symptoms, obviously memory loss, but a lot of times disorientation, loss of muscle coordination, things of that nature, and it's a progressive disease. When someone gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, not all the time, but typical, the typical course is that disease runs about 10 years, and it is fatal, so it will cause death. If a person has Alzheimer's, they're either going to die because of the Alzheimer's, or they're going to die with Alzheimer's of something else. So there is no cure at the current time. There are drugs now that are trying to reduce symptoms and things like that, but and potentially prolong life. But eventually, the person's brain gets eaten away so much that they revert back to childlike or infant-like behavior, and they have to be totally fed and cared for just like you would an infant. It's a devastating disease, not only for the individual, but for the individual's family, loved ones. Anybody that knows someone with Alzheimer's is going to be devastated by the results of this disease. Now, the biggest risk factor for Alzheimer's is age. People over 65 kind of the magic age. That's about the time period when you start to see a whole lot more instances of Alzheimer's. That does not mean that someone can't get it prior to that. I actually had a friend who he was around 50 years old when he developed early onset of Alzheimer's, and literally it took his life within about 5 years. Totally destroyed his entire existence there. So now, as I said, the biggest risk factor is age. It's kind of interesting because think of it this way. Not all people, not all old people have Alzheimer's. We'll talk about that in a minute. But of the people who do at age 65, let's take for a minute and say, okay, we're going to look only at people who are 65 years old right this minute. And if you take that group of people that are 65 years old right now, and whatever the number of people that have Alzheimer's in that group is right now, by the time they reach 70, so 5 years from now, that same group of people, the incidence of Alzheimer's will have doubled. It doubles, it tends to double every 5 years after age 65. So whoever has it at age 65, that number of people, that number will double by age 70. When that group becomes 75, the total will double again, and so on. So again, the advancement in age is the big thing. Now, before we move from this slide, I want to explain one thing too, and that is dementia. A lot of people don't understand the difference between what we mean when we talk about Alzheimer's and what we talk about with dementia. Dementia, they're not the same thing. Dementia involves a loss of intellectual functions, things like thinking, remembering, reasoning, that's sufficient enough to basically interfere with a person's daily functioning. Okay, so dementia is not a disease itself, but basically it's a group of symptoms that we can talk about that people are experiencing. And again, those symptoms might even include things like changes in personality or mood or behavior. But those are changes in symptoms. So dementia are symptoms that can involve all those things, memory loss and so forth. Alzheimer's disease is the slow destruction of the brain. And you can see it in this picture here. Here is a healthy brain, and here is an advanced case of Alzheimer's, and you can see the destruction that's taken place. We'll look at this picture again here in just a minute. So we could technically say, if dementia and Alzheimer's, if you understand these terms, we could say that people with dementia do not necessarily have Alzheimer's. But everyone who has Alzheimer's experiences dementia. So if you understand those two terms, then that statement should make sense. Okay? Now, let's take a look. Here, I wanted to show you this just so that you can understand again the progression of destruction in the brain. Here, essentially, grade 1 is a normal, healthy brain, and you can see from various angles. Here is a moderate case. The middle line is a moderate case of Alzheimer's, and then the bottom line, grade 3, is an advanced case or severe case of Alzheimer's. Now, the thing you notice, okay, let's just take a look at one thing, and that is the ventricles in the brain. The ventricles are like these little gapped areas right here in the middle. Okay, you can kind of see, and you can see how small they are. But in a normal, healthy brain, the ventricles are filled with fluid, which helps to nourish the brain. It provides nourishment, nutrients for the brain. But you can see how these ventricles have expanded, and by the time that you get an advanced case, look, I mean, you can see where the brain is eaten away. And obviously, if the ventricles, which are the open areas in the brain, if those get bigger, that means you have fewer brain cells, that the brain itself is shrinking. And that's what you have with Alzheimer's. Let's take a look real quick at one other thing. Here on one of the a good website for Alzheimer's kind of shows again a normal healthy looking brain. Here's an advanced case of Alzheimer's, and you can see even the texture, everything about it, it has changed. When you see the destruction in the brain like this, it's no wonder the symptoms that these people are experiencing. Sometimes you may get frustrated with someone who has Alzheimer's because you just can't understand why they're saying what they're doing, or saying what they're talking about that may not make sense, or they're doing what you think are crazy things. But their brain, if you take a look, this light colored area around this brain, that's the destruction that's occurred in terms of the size of the brain. Okay? Now, why does this happen? Well, okay, here's that picture that we were talking about or looking at a few minutes ago. But why does this occur? Well, if you look under a microscope, okay, what they found is that there is various plaque and tangles that result in the brain. Here is a normal, healthy look in a microscope at the cells, okay, the neuron cells in the brain. Those are healthy. Now, if you look over here, this is an unhealthy, or this is an Alzheimer's example right here. What occurs is that plaque, because of a particular protein in the brain, we think anyway, because of a particular protein, plaque begins to develop in the brain, and that plaque attacks a healthy nerve system, a healthy neuron. And what happens then is, as that neuron begins to get destroyed, it literally begins forming tangled messes in the brain. And as a result of that, the entire neuron, the entire cell, begins to just disappear. Okay, it ceases to exist. It dies off. And as it dies off, well, then you see the destruction in the brain that we saw in those previous pictures. So that's the case of Alzheimer's. That's the thing that, again, most people are familiar with when we talk about organic mental disorders. Two other disorders or diseases, whatever you want to call them, that can also be kind of included in the organic mental disorders. You may have heard of them: Parkinson's disease, I'm sure you've heard of that, and then Korsakoff syndrome. In Parkinson's disease, again, it's a problem with the death of the neurons, which is the central cell in the brain. It's the death of those neurons because of, again, a problem with a particular protein, or at least that's the current research that's coming out. They're still working on that, but it's an issue where literally certain neurons, dopamine producing neurons in the midbrain, start dying off, and as a result you have a lot of problems with not just mental but also physical abilities, coordination, things like that. So the person experiences a lot of very stiff and very rigid movements. Michael J. Fox is a good example where you may have seen him from Back to the Future movies and things like that, back before he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and now you see him on TV and you see the problems, the issues he has. Muhammad Ali is another good example. So Parkinson's disease is another example, though, of the destruction of certain parts of the brain and how it can react or respond in terms of our behavior. Korsakoff syndrome actually results from malnourishment, and you see this oftentimes in people who are alcoholic, or people who maybe have eating disorders and they're not getting proper vitamins. The vitamin thoracine, I think, is what it's called. If you have a severe lack of that particular vitamin, well, then people can start experiencing, again, problems with memory, with being able to keep track of the task that they're trying to get done. They have extreme problems just trying to even remember simple things, short-term memories. So a lot of times they'll start to create memories. They'll make them up into what they think might have happened, and in reality that's not the case. So those things again take place, but again, it's a vitamin deficiency, and it affects the thalamus in the brain. There is treatment for that in the case that the person first has to totally stop drinking any kind of alcoholic beverage, and then take vitamin supplements and get better nutrition, and usually the damage to the brain can be eventually halted, and the progression, the advancements that they can make usually are best in the first couple years after that. But all three of these cases that we looked at, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Korsakoff's, and there are others that go into this organic mental disorders list, are things where it's a result of actual damage to the brain.